Hey, and welcome to this session in Excel. Today we're going to look at pivot tables. Pivot tables are a way to put all your database data into a specific program in Excel that lets you manipulate and change and mess around with that data easily without necessarily changing what's in your database. You're just changing what part of the data you're looking at. So you're changing the visual representation of it. Because you can twist it around and see very easily in different ways, you can look at this data. They named it a pivot table because you can, or a pivot table because you can pivot it. So you can twist it, so on. So the way to do that, we see here we have a table, and we can manage this table in several different ways and look at it and so on. But the easiest way to do so, and the easiest way to do so if we want to change things around, is to do so in a pivot table. So we go to Insert, and we click on Pivot Table here. So as long as we have clicked in any cell here in our data, in our database, when we click Pivot Table, it will automatically sort of figure out that it's probably this data you want. So we see here with this moving line here is that it has selected the data for us all the way down to row 254. Now, if we have more data, for example, in row or column H and I and J, but nothing in G, it might not be able to catch that. So you have to look first to see that it's selected the data you want. Now, the thing with pivot table is very easy to work around and look at the specific points you want to look at. So if we're right now only interested in looking at the date and the opening prices, for example, we wouldn't want to reduce the data to just those two columns. It's better to make a pivot table with all our data, and then we can narrow it down in our pivot table rather than narrowing down the source. So we want to keep as much of the database as possible in the pivot table. Now, there are some size limitations if we were talking about a huge data set, but for the ones we're looking at in this course, it's better to just include everything in the pivot table. So we select all of this and we create it in a new worksheet. Always put it in a new worksheet, because if you put an existing one, sometimes the pivot table gets a bit cranky and so on. So it's always best to have it in a new worksheet. And this worksheet is good to name. Let's name it pivot right now. We just clicked on it and named it pivot or something like that, so that we know that it's there. Especially true if we're making a bunch of these, it's good to know which sheets there are. We don't want to have 500 different sheets all named sheet 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If we have that's just confusing. We don't know where we are in our data. It's better to name them. So this would be our our data or our database, and this would be our pivot or pivot of this database. And if we have several pivots, several pivot tables, we might want to name them various different names, but don't have it named like this. It takes 1 second to name it, and it's very convenient to not do so, but then later on you're like, wait, where's my data? Where am I? You get very easily confused as to where you are if you don't name them. So we've now created the pivot table, and this doesn't show us much. As soon as we click here, we get, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. As soon as we click here, we get this field. Now this field, and we also get these pivot table tools, analyze and design. This field allows us to show things here. So we select things here, which is the general box for where our various variables in our data are. Remember, we had 6 of them. We can see that here: date, open, high, low, close, and volume. That's 6 variables. And we have these 4 boxes here. And the thing to do is either you click, or easier, just drag them. So click, hold, and drag where we want our variables to go. So rows is what we want to display in our rows, columns what we want to display in our columns, and values is what we want to show, and filters if we want to filter out certain things. So let's look at that. Let's see here. So let's look at volumes, for example. We put that, we get all our volumes. Maybe it wasn't that useful. Let's look at dates instead. See, we have dates. Okay. And now let's put volume in our values, and we get the sum of volumes for these dates. So what happened here? And the best way to learn pivot tables is to just mess around with them. Drag things around, see what happens when you drag things here. If you drag them there, what happens? Nothing. Here, get that. Drag them up here. Oh, it becomes really long and strange. Okay. Well, what we have is that we put the date here, and we get actually three selections here. We get years, quarters, and dates. So we actually have a hierarchy here where we have the years sorted into quarters, sorted into months, which is what the date thing is. So if we remove, for example, the quarters, these are going to disappear. The quarter one and quarter two and quarter three and quarter four. So let's remove quarters and we'll see what happens. Now we just get the years and the months. And what do we get here? We get the sum of the volume. So it just adds all the volumes together that belong to the same month. So we only have one point for the 30th of April 2019. And we see here then that we get that volume here, right? For this is only one, we only have one data point for April. The sum would thus be the same as the volume here, which is true. So now we can do the sum of volume, but that doesn't help us that much. We only have 1 month date here, and we might want more. So let's go instead to value field settings, and we can change this to be the average. So instead of having the sum, we have the average. And now we get the average. And it's perhaps not great because we have decimals here and no decimals there. So let's just see if we can change that around, which we can. We can do it for all of this. We changed it to, let's just remove the decimals. There we go. And now we see which has like the average of more trading and not. And we see in August had a lot more trading than, for example, July in this GE stock. We also see that we get a total, and we also get a total for each year here, or in this case, the averages, because we chose the average here. If we want to have the sum as well, what can we do? We can just drag this down another time, and we get the sum of the volumes. So now we can compare the averages to the sum. If we don't want to have it in this way, we can drag this up and instead have the years be as columns, and these two, we get this little values thing, be the rows, if we prefer that. What happens if we only drag down one? We get the date and the years. We see that it gets, we get the years here and the dates. So let's remove the sum. And then we see here, we have for 2019 and 2020, we have this distinction here for the various months. And we see that if we had more months than that, then we could get, for example, we could get the various years, each month, each year, and a total. If we want to get rid of these totals, we can just right-click and go to Pivot Table Options, and there go to Totals and Filters and remove these. We don't need them. Click back here to get this box back. If we want to filter, for example, if we want to filter on certain, let's filter on we can click here and we can bring the open price here to filters and then filter on various opening prices to only look at certain opening prices, or we can take the quarters down and we can filter on various quarters, only show us quarters 2 and 3 and so on. So we can easily apply that. So we see here we change what we want to look at. We can look at it various different ways very easily in Pivot. We just throw things around, and here we can change this by clicking on this little triangle and go into value field settings to change if we want to look at the average. What else do we have? We have the sum. We have the count, just counts how many there are. We have the maximum, the minimum, and the rest we usually are not going to use for this course and usually not applied. And we see here that we can change things. And again, this just changed the representation, what we see. The actual data is still from here, and it's collected. So this uses this data. If we change this data, will it change what happens here? Not necessarily. But so if we add another, or if we change this or something like that, how do we get that data into this pivot table? Well, we go here to Analyze, and we click Refresh. That way we can change the data. So if we, let's change this volume now to what is that, 200 million. This still stays the same. But now if I go here to Analyze, Refresh, it changes. So we see that that's an easy way to update your pivot tables with the source that they have. And I just click undo twice to come back to this, and then I click refresh again. I didn't have to because that was done with the undo. So we now see ways to work with our pivot tables, how to create one from our database, and how to get various things in it. If we make a graph of this, for example, we might want to make a graph of this data. Not recommended charts, just make a line chart like that. We see here that this chart is connected to our pivot table. So let's remove this filter there. It's connected with the pivot table. So we get this, the average of volume, that's what we're displaying here, and then we have the date and the years. So if we change this to the sum, the graph follows. And see here. We can remove this by just right-clicking and going, let's see. We click on the actual button and go hide all field buttons on chart. That removes all these various buttons. Can be a nice thing if we want to use the graph. And if we want to use the graph, we can't just copy it and paste it somewhere because it will still be connected to a pivot table. So when we change things around, which we are want to do, we're going to change things around here quite a bit. So instead, when we copy this and want to paste it somewhere in a database, or maybe have an overview sheet or something, we don't want to just paste it like this, because then it comes with, we see that the little pivot chart options come up when we paste it. No, instead we want to paste it with paste special and just paste it as a picture. So it's a static picture, we can't change anything with it, and that way this won't change when we change these values. The same way, when we copy these things, we just paste them in as values. And again, we see it here in scientific notation. We can change that to a number. And that way, it's no longer connected. We don't want the things we take out of the pivot table to be connected to it, because we're going to change things around in our pivot table. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Okay, so now we're a bit warmed up. Now we are a bit comfortable with pivot tables, and the best way to learn about pivot tables is to use them a lot to sort of figure them out. But the whole theoretical point of the pivot table is to have a sort of a sandbox where you can mess around with things, but the actual data is still intact. We're not changing any of the data by moving these around. We're just changing what part of the data we're accessing here, and that's what we're doing. And it's a quite popular thing to do with data, is to have ways to manipulate it without actually changing the underlying data, just what we're representing and looking at in this moment.